Hello, Robs. We're back with Anyone's Son, a true story by Roberta Roche with Harry de la Roche Jr. Number 31, Section 31, whatever you want to call it. The big day was August 2nd, and as the last inmate was brought to the annex, Sheriff Job announced the fortress would be closed permanently. When the annex was opened in the 1960s, the low tan brick building intended for minor offenders was regarded as a good example of a model penal institution. While I was there in 1977, it was being expanded to include more maximum security cells, additional dormitories, and other up-to-date renovations. The day that we were taken there, we were brought down two at a time, and it was a major event for me just to see the outdoors. I hadn't seen a tree in the sky or the sun, moon, or stars for the last 8 months of my life. Poor guy. The officers were taking no chances with us because, along with handcuffing us, the officer sitting in the front of the van had a gun, which he pointed at us. Once we got to the annex, I was put in a holding cell. Then I was taken to maximum security and placed in one of the 38 cells used to house violent or dangerous inmates. One of the guys in with me was convicted of robbery, rape, and kidnapping. Another man shot his wife. Guards brought our food to the cell blocks on pie tins with a spoon. Then they passed around the knives, which they always made sure to count. Despite the improved facilities available at the annex, daily life wasn't very different than it was at the main jail. I wasn't able to get a job since I was one of the bad guys, and in the yard I could only sit because I couldn't take the risk of breaking my glasses in a game. My only extras were sunglasses, and I couldn't see myself in court wearing sunglasses to the trial. In August, Roy Nielsen answered a call to a church in Maryland, and the intern minister at my church was Pastor Charles Immendorf. Until he answered a call himself, he was dean of a Lutheran college where he taught several courses. I considered him quite a scholar, and whenever he came to visit me, we had good conversations on philosophy and religion. Sometimes he'd bring me communion, too. By the end of August, it was obvious that the annex that had once seemed so promising was chaotic and overcrowded. It was ripe for racial tensions, and it was never intended for murderers or rapists and armed robbers. We had many problem prisoners who were sent from our one county facility to another, as well as several convicted inmates who were waiting for space in state prisons. The latter caused problems for other inmates and understaffed jail officials, and sometimes it seemed that the inmates were really running the jail. Some of the inmates called me a fink because I went for so many visits with my lawyer, minister, and the Greers. There were all kinds of rumors about me until I had to say, look, you guys, you want me to fink? I know enough to screw people in here. You really want me to fink? After that, a few guys shut up. As soon as it was September, I couldn't wait for the trial date, September 26th. I needed some clothes for the trial, so I gave Aunt Arden my measurements. Then the Greers went out and bought a blue suit with 2 pairs of pants and a reversible vest. Uncle John had my favorite boots repaired and polished for me. The state had turned over the investigative matter John Taylor was waiting for, so after the months of waiting in jail, it seemed we were ready for the trial. But 10 days before the scheduled start, the Record, which served Bergen County, ran a provocative op-ed piece that took a dim view of cases built on the insanity defense. It didn't mention me by name, but the writer talked about people who had killed their families and pointed out that many of them, after winning an insanity defense, killed other family members when they were released. John didn't like the timing right before my trial. Then, a few days later, he was more concerned when another newspaper story mentioned the liquidation sale that was held in our Montvale house. That in itself would have been okay, but the person who wrote the article said Harry de la Roche Sr., his wife and 2 sons were slain in their sleep by a third son. The word alleged wasn't anywhere, so John met with Judge Madden on September 23rd, the day I turned 19, to ask To have the trial delayed because of the newspaper publicity and the statement that I slew my family. I was upset about this, but Judge Madden postponed the trial, and a new date was set for October 24th. The annex continued to be overcrowded for the rest of the time I was there. One inmate who really made trouble was an F word named Harriet. She was black and built so heavily she made many guys' chests look small, and when she started to show me attention, she really ticked me off. She was mostly interested in young white males, and after she arrived, she and her clique beat a young guy who rejected her advances. The beating turned out to be so severe he had to be taken by ambulance for treatment at Bergen Pines Hospital. This so-called named Harriet, was it an actual... It must have been a guy, right? Oh, yeah, he says she in quotations. So he had a cross-dresser, or was it a trans? When I spurned Harriet's advances too, she came to my cell to attack me while 3 other blacks came along for support. That day, the clique threatened me with knives, and I lost my commissary order. The second episode was far worse, though, and it happened October 10. Shortly after lunch, my cellmate and I got our commissary order and decided to leave our cell since inmates could go to the day room at any time they chose. We didn't usually lock our cells, so just as we were about to leave, Harriet and her henchmen came storming down to our cell and proceeded to take our commissary order. The gang had a stolen knife from the kitchen, along with a sawed-off broom handle, which they used as a club. They started slapping and punching, and one guy threatened to kill me. Then they upended our bunk beds, and 2 of the inmates ransacked the cell, while 3 or 4 others stood guard. They totally destroyed my cell that day by breaking and ripping whatever they could, stuffing things in the toilet and stepping on what was left. My sunglasses and radio were totaled, and they tore up every one of my books, including my small address book. Then my cellmate and I were told to leave and not come back to the cell. All I had left was a pair of shoes and the glasses and clothes I had on. I was so scared at the moment I hardly thought of the loss, and the thing my cellmate and I wanted most was to get ourselves out of that cell block before the gang really killed us. We asked to leave the wing for safety, but the officers were pretty helpless, so our only out was the day room, where more of that clique threatened us. When I finally got off the cell block, I was almost stabbed when leaving. It was about 1:30 when the authorities locked us in isolation. This meant that we were in a cell that had no running water and only a hole in the ground for a toilet. It stank of urine and feces and was cold without blankets or sheets. The only time you could have a drink was when the food arrived. I stayed there from 1:30 on Monday afternoon till I went to Bergen Pines Hospital early Wednesday morning for an electroencephalogram, brain scan, and chest and skull series. All the results were normal, but I felt like a slob when I went for the tests since I hadn't been able to take a shower and my clothes were smelly and dirty. When I returned from the hospital, I was moved to a material witness section. The authorities thought I'd be safer there since the persons in material witness are either work release people or inmates with petty offenses. Nothing happened to my attackers in the way of punishment, so when the Greers heard about it, they felt the matter shouldn't pass without an investigation. I was afraid to say much, though, except for telling John Taylor, because I feared the retribution that goes on in jail. Aunt Arden started things going by talking on the telephone with Undersheriff Peter Curcio, a stocky, gray-haired man who handled the annex's operations. She asked how the incident happened and why I was the one who was punished by going to isolation. The undersheriff told her that isolation was the only place to put me at the time. Then he suggested that she come down and told her that, along with other officers, she could meet with me. As we sat in Curcio's office on the following morning, the officer tried to tell her, right in front of me, that they thought the fight was over my cellmate, who they earmarked as a homosexual. Then they went on to intimate I might be a homo. too, and that I'd wanted that cellmate so we could live together. He was my friend, not my lover, and though he was labeled as a troublemaker, he was good to me while I knew him. The officers told Aunt Arden that the only way to investigate this was for me to reveal the names of the attackers and sign a formal complaint. But when I saw her for a moment alone, I told her I couldn't press charges. There's no way I'll sign a complaint, I said. They'd eat me alive if I did. News of the incident traveled, however, and when Sheriff Job heard about it, he decided to investigate it without my signing a complaint. A young staff writer at the Record, John Banazuski, who covered crime, also got wind of the incident and showed up at the jail. He wanted to write about the attack for the next Sunday's edition, so he spoke at length with Sheriff Job and Under Sheriff Curcio. Then he interviewed Aunt Arden. His story on October 16 got me back in the papers again. After Banazuski wrote his first account, he decided to do a follow-up story exposing more details, so he asked John Taylor to write Sheriff Job and ask for permission to visit me and ask questions about the attack. I told John I'd like to do this, so John wrote the following letter, which later turned out to be a controversial matter. October 19th, 1977. Sheriff Joseph F. Job, Bergen County Jail Annex, River Road, Hackensack, New Jersey. Dear Sheriff Job, my client, Harry W. De La Roche Jr. has expressed a desire to meet with a Mr. John Banazuski, a reporter for the Record at Hackensack, New Jersey. I have discussed the matter with Mr. De La Roche, and it is his wish and desire that he be permitted to talk with the aforementioned person. I have no objection to Mr. De La Roche meeting with Mr. Banazuski. However, I shall not be present at any of the meetings. I would therefore appreciate it if you would be so kind as to permit Mr. Banazuski to meet with Mr. De La Roche at the annex so that they may discuss whatever affairs exist between them. I have no further objection, as this meeting should occur immediately, and I respectfully request that you honor my client's desire to talk with Mr. Banazuski. Very truly yours, Kleinberg and Taylor, John R. Taylor, Jr. JRT LSB CC John Banazuski. When the newspaper reporter arrived with his recorder, we met in the small visitor's room where I usually saw my lawyer. We talked in general for a little while. Then he began asking lots of stuff that I was glad to answer because since late in August, I'd wanted to see a newspaper reporter and let more people know what had happened on November 28th. Except for a break for supper, we talked for about 4 hours, and I told the reporter about coming home and finding my parents and Eric dead and Ronnie sitting on his bed. The reporter said he'd be writing that story, and that was okay by me. He didn't say when it would be printed, though. And I thought since the trial was scheduled to start, he'd wait till the jury was selected. All hell broke loose on Sunday, October 23rd, when the story appeared with the headline, De La Roche blames brother for murder. I was immediately criticized for telling the story outside of the courtroom, and John Taylor was accused of generating shocking pretrial publicity and possibly a postponement or mistrial by permitting an 11th hour interview. Later, John would argue that the Banazuski interview was solely to talk about the rape attempts, while Banazuski would contend there was no express agreement limiting the scope of his questions. The Record was put on the griddle for running the article on the front page on the eve of the trial, and in jail there was such a furor I wasn't allowed a razor so I could shave that day. I also had to eat by myself instead of going to the cafeteria, where the guards thought I might have trouble. And trouble you did have. That's all for section 31. About 80 more pages left. Anyone's son. Goodbye, bruv.